Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com and to another blog and another podcast. Today we're in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 11 through 16, which reads, "As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need." That is 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 11 through 16. We have been studying 1 Timothy chapter 5 for some time now. The subject of this section is the care of widows. In today's text, the Apostle Paul provides instructions for the young widows who would be more likely to remarry, given that their husbands have either deserted them, died, or divorced. In verse 11, we read, "As for the younger widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry." For the woman who is younger than 60 and is widowed, and she finds that she has the desire to remarry, the Apostle Paul writes, "Do not put her on the list of widows." In fact, the apostle instructs us to encourage her to remarry, to make a lifelong commitment to the man the Lord has brought into her life, even if she had committed to serve the Lord as a single person. This is normal, and there's nothing wrong for her to want to spend the rest of her days with a man that she is attracted to and whom she can care for. In verses 12 and 13, we read, "Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house, and not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to." If these younger widows still had the desire to marry, Paul encourages them to marry. God puts these desires in our hearts, even if she had made a pledge to serve the Lord as a widow. The judgment in verse 12 sounds like it's coming from God, but on the contrary, the judgment in verse 12 would have been from those who were aware of her first pledge to serve the Lord as a widow and never marry again. She was being judged not by the Lord, but by his people. In verse 13, the Apostle Paul describes a woman who has the desire to get married again, yet she thinks this desire is not from God. When we do not understand God's will for our lives, it is then that we are more likely to feed the flesh. Thinking the desire is not from God, we wrestle with it more and more. Then we struggle to know what to do with the angst that has been created. And when we find ourselves in these places, we do what is easiest and most natural. We give in, you guessed it, to the flesh. This is what Paul is describing in verse 13. There's a descent into feeding the flesh in verse 13, and it's all based on bad theology. Lest any of us become judgmental, we have all experienced this when we have concluded the wrong thing about the Lord's will for our lives, and we're discouraged and distracted, and we do not know what to do. It is at this point that we find ourselves giving up on walking with His Spirit, and we resort to feeding the flesh. The flesh always has a greater chance to strengthen itself when we start operating off an incorrect understanding of God and His will for our lives. And think of it, her desire to be married is from God. If it is God's will for the widow to remarry, she should not be involved in the ministry that those who are 60 and older are involved in. I have found when I am out of God's will for my life, the flesh seems to be that much more stronger in its lure of getting me to go its way. The key here is to know God's will and to do it. And for a widow, remarrying is not sinful. But being a busybody is, especially if she is saying things that are the products of the flesh. In verses 14 and 15, we read, "So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander." Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. The apostle here gives some reasons for encouraging us to encourage a widow to remarry, primarily to have children. This was God's command to our first parents in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28. So the normal result of marriage is a family. Raising up children who have a heart for the Lord and others is the purpose for which God has designed the home. Having and training children to love God is God's purpose for mankind. And even though a woman had been married, lost her husband, and needed to be remarried again, the purpose doesn't change. It still stands. We live in a culture which rejects the idea of the wife not working and the husband being the breadwinner for the family. But this is God's design. This is one of several explanations for the disintegration of the American family. I'm a proponent of the American dream, but when the American dream gets in the way of God's design for the family, it's not biblical. And I know it's hard. My wife and I lived off a Christian school salary for years, but we were determined to obey the Lord's teaching. And He blessed us and provided even when we were going through some of the most lean moments and days and weeks and months and years. We were convinced that someone in a daycare would not train our children quite the way we would if their mama had stayed home with them. So we bit the bullet. Mama stayed home with them, and they benefited. To ignore God's design for the family is paramount to turning away to Satan's way of thinking and living. Thus, the apostles' comment of going the way of Satan in verse 15. In verse 16, we read, "If any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them, and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need." Paul is careful here to not discourage those who want to do this ministry to those who are widows. God has always had a heart for the helpless, the weak, the lonely, and the discouraged. This is a major reason why you and I have been included in His family, that we might have a heart for the neglected, lonely, and despairing. And even if we are not ministering to widows today, the principle is yet for us all. The work isn't for us all, but the principle is. What is the principle? Look for someone to encourage today. Lord knows we need it in this sin-ravaged world. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, don't hesitate to shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.